All right, today we're talking about how to build and grow a content marketing business, especially in today's economy, and why it's important that you should be embracing content marketing today. My guest today is Jonathan Small. I'll tell you more about him in a second, so stay tuned.
Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we feature top entrepreneurs, business leaders, and thought leaders and ask them how they built key relationships to get where they are today. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. You know, if you've listened before, that each week I get to talk to interesting entrepreneurs, founders, CEOs, all kinds of different people from backgrounds. We've had companies like Netflix and Grubhub, Redfin, Gusto, Kinko's, and many more on this show. So check out the archives. Lots of great episodes for you there. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise 25, our company where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. You can visit us at rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com to learn more about what it is we do. And of course, our guests here today, before I get to them, I want to give a big shout out to Anna David of Legacy Launchpad Publishers. She is a longtime friend who introduced us to today's guest, who I have a lot in common with. So I'm really excited to talk to him. He's an award-winning author, journalist, producer, and podcast host. He's worked as a multimedia storyteller for many different companies, including the New York Times, Hearst, Condé Nast, and held executive roles at Glamour, Stuff, and Entrepreneur, and has contributed for a bunch of different publications. Fun fact, he was once the only male staffer at Cosmo. Let's ask about what that was like in his 20s too. And he has got a new book. It's called Right About Now, 30 authors on origin stories, creative inspiration, and the birth of their bestsellers. It's based on the podcast that he has done for a number of years. And Jonathan, I'm so excited to have you here today. And I always love to start people off by hearing about what they were like as a kid. And some people do lemonade stands. Some people did babysitting. I love to hear these entrepreneurial side hustles that people had. And you were a DJ. You started DJing.
Yes. I guess that's an unusual one. That was my kind of early entrepreneurial experience. And by the way, thank you for having me on the show. It's really fun to be here. In seventh grade, I'm going to date myself here, but in seventh grade, somebody put on the Rapper's Delight at a middle school dance.
Oh, it's a great song.
It kind of blew my mind. Like I had never, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, and I had never heard anything like a rap before. Nobody had. I mean, it was really one of the first raps ever recorded, and it just blew my mind. And I became obsessed with hip hop and rapping, and I, it kind of led down this road to DJing. Because it was like, what does a DJ do? And, watching like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and all these guys that I would really like were like my role models at that time. And I went out to Radio Shack. I don't think Radio Shack exists anymore. And I bought a mixer.
I think there's maybe one or two left.
Yeah. And I bought a little mixer, which is, the thing that enables you to kind of mix two turntables. And I set up my little turntables on my amp, and I started, practicing in my house. And nobody was doing this. Nobody even knew what a DJ was. But as time went on and there became a need for DJs and things like school dances and bar mitzvahs, my services were suddenly needed. And I created a company called The Chill Factor. Great name. I used to have my business card from The Chill Factor on my desk, but it's a gold emblazoned. It's like the cheesiest thing you've ever seen.
Yes, it is. Of course. Of course.
It was a gold emblazoned at The Chill Factor. And I would show up and DJ dances and play all sorts of different music, not just hip hop, but like even like the B-52s and whatever was like popular. I remember playing, this is even like playing, Rock Lobster and
take down the house.
Remember everybody loved that. So that was my first sort of entrepreneurial. And the funny thing is that has never really gone away. Like I am DJing. This Sunday night, I'm DJing an event for this organization called SONA, which is, I think, the Songwriters Organization of North America or something. And it's a big event out here. And I still DJ. Like it's a side hustle. Wow. It's not something that's like I do to kind of make a lot of money, but I'm always available. I've got my equipment and
once a DJ, always a DJ.
Once a DJ, always a DJ.
So you have records over your shoulder here.
I do have a lot of vinyl.
Do you still use records on a turntable, or is it all digital?
I held out for a long time. I refused to go digital, and then eventually my back gave out. Just lugging those records around.
That's a lot of weight. Yeah.
It's a lot of crates of records. So I went digital. and I have not gone back. I still have my turntables, and my son, who has followed in my footsteps and is now also DJing. He's just went to start college this year, but even in high school, he was a sort of the high school DJ, and he would use vinyl. It's like the kids today, the Gen Z, they're still into vinyl. Like he's into vinyl. And, he was having all the problems I remember having, like records skipping and people hitting the table and like things. And, like I was like, you don't have to really deal with this with digital, but he's like, I love the vinyl. I love the way it sounds. He just loves the feel of it,
Coincidentally, I've taken my 14-year-old into 2 record stores in the last few weeks, and they're hard to find. There's one in Mill Valley, California, in Marin County, which is not too far from us, and one in San Francisco, but there aren't many. Yeah. And I'm kind of curious, like, why people buy records these days.
There's a collectors like me, and then there's people like my son who just love the experience of it. The looking at the record, while you sit on the bed. Remember how, you'd bring a record home and you put it on the liner notes and lie on your bed with the liner notes. Mm-hmm. I think they miss that. And there's something nostalgic, obviously, for us, but for them, there's something, and maybe it's because they grew up with parents that used to listen to vinyl and talked about vinyl all the time. And of course, my son had no chance because he was, surrounded by my music all the time. But my daughter hasn't exactly embraced it, but he really embraced it. The other thing I was interested in is the kids are apparently into magazines again. Like they like the physical, tangible holding a magazine. Like they're interested in looking at magazines, and who knows
what's next? Newsprint? Get all that stuff on your fingers. It's not that great.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's where you start off, and once a DJ, always a DJ. So you keep on doing it. But let's flash forward to you become a writer, and I don't know what will point this job as the only guy on staff at Cosmo magazine. You're in your late 20s.
Greatest job of all time.
And you were an advice journalist at Cosmo?
Yeah, there's a column. Well, so I was on staff at Glamour. I wrote for Cosmo, but on Glamour, which is basically, they're indistinguishable to me. At Glamour magazine, which is a Condé Nast magazine, I got a job. I guess I was in my late 20s, and they had a column called Jake. And any sort of woman of a certain age knows what Jake is. It's just we wouldn't know because we're guys, but Jake was an advice column that had been in the magazine for years, and it was written by Jake. But there had been many Jakes, right? I was not the first or the last Jake. And Jake would answer women's questions about guys, and he would also kind of just give, write columns about dating. I remember saying, writing a column about third dates and like why the importance of third dates. And I just remember some of the silly things that I used to write about, but I had no business writing an advice column. I have no experience. My wife is now a relationship therapist. So she actually has training in this, and she laughs that I did this for a living. Like what qualifications did I have other than the fact that I was a man, a man who was currently at that time dating women.
And were you a man about town at the time? Were you quite the ladies' man?
Oh yeah, no, I never considered. In fact, it was kind of a little in joke with my friends, like, "How are you?" Jake. Right. It's just funny because, I would write a fictional thing called Diary Fee for Red Book, which was a kind of like almost like a Sex in the City, but from a male perspective, and I would sort of channel my man about town that I wanted to be in that fictional blog column. And pretend that I was this kind of like, lecherous bad boy, but I was never that guy. I did go out and I did DJ. I had some DJ gigs back then in New York City, but I was never cool in that way. I've never had game, ever. Yeah. But I was good at telling women what to do, just not very good at following my own advice.
And, you think about it back then, if you wanted to get advice from someone of this sort, what you were looking for, this kind of like men's advice for women column, there weren't many sources. You had to go to these magazines or something like that. And now anyone can do it. You can think how many people opine and give their opinion, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's on their own blog or a YouTube channel or something like that. So can you just reflect a little bit on just how dramatically in the course of 10, 20 years, that market has changed? Like, what is the role for a traditional magazine column, if at all, now when virtually anyone can build up an audience and can opine and give their opinion on things?
things have changed so much. I call myself sort of the pivot king. I've had to pivot so many times in my career as the technology has changed, as the way people consume media has changed. And I think this is probably where you and I also have a lot of parallels, where it's like we've
For
had to
sure.
kind of
I mean, I've been through 5 or 6 careers, I think, you
yeah.
know?
I mean, I'm
Yeah.
wondering when this one's going to end, because it's like, oh, all of a sudden people are saying podcasting is kind of like, becoming not as popular as it was. It's like, oh my God, another, now AI comes and I'm going to have to shift again. But I'm ready for it. But I have pivoted. I mean, I started in traditional magazine journalism in the 90s, which was the heyday of the 90s. It was an incredible time to be a magazine journalist. I remember Condé Nast used to pay for car service. If we worked past 6 o'clock, all of us would get car service home.
Wow.
These line of town cars,
Doesn't
outside
exist.
Broadway, and we'd all kind of get into our town cars and get taken home. I mean, those days are so long gone.
Yeah.
But I've just every phase of the way, I went from print, then I went to digital, then I shifted to video production because that was a thing in the sort of early 2000s. Then that stopped being a pop. Then I went to podcasting. Now I'm doing content marketing. I've ghostwritten. I've really done quite a bit of different careers, but the one thread has always been, creative and writing. There's always been a lot of writing. It seems to me that people have always valued me as a writer. And so that has definitely been a thread that's kind of taken me through. But boy, yeah, you're right. I mean, I can't even imagine being an advice columnist now. I've had a few on my podcast, and they're a dime a dozen. I don't know how you separate yourself from all the TikTokers that are doing it, and from all.
Yeah, or if it was me, I would try and build up my own brand at the same time, so that you control your own channel, so that it's
have
not
a Substack,
Yeah, the problem with that, the reason why all the Jakes are interchangeable is because none of those Jakes had their own channel. They didn't control the means of distribution.
Right.
Whereas now they can. You can, if you put in the work to build that up. You also were an executive at the Game Show Network, which actually I don't talk about it much on this podcast, but I started my career in game shows. So
that's wild.
In the 90s, when the DreamWorks studio was kind of like the Tesla of its day, it was super hot company at the time. And that one of their first projects, weirdly, was creating a game show that didn't last very long. And I was a production assistant on it for a summer.
What was it called?
Cool. It was called Majority Rules.
Okay.
It was only on in a couple of different markets. It had Mark Summers of Double Dare was on it, and Arthel Neville eventually became the co-host, the two of them. And it was filmed on the old Johnny Carson Tonight Show set. Leno had moved his set over to the next studio over. And so I was just in the thick of it. Every day I'd see Leno's car parked out there, different car every day.
Different car, yeah.
And whatever celebrity was going to be on the Tonight Show would be walking through. I'd pass by them half the time. It's fun and exciting being in those places. But
to be in the lot, I always wanted to work on a lot like that. I live in LA and I have not had that experience, but there's something incredible.
You see those gates. You drive, and if you live in LA, you drive past those big gates. And sometimes you see people going in, and
people
cool.
drive around their golf carts around. It's kind of it always seemed really kind of magical to me.
What was that like, though? Working at the Game Show Network. This is about 2013. It looks like.
Yeah, 2013. So it was an interesting job. So at that time, I was kind of pretty immersed in digital video. I had kind of graduated from doing editorial work to doing video work, where I was kind of helping to produce videos. And again, I had no background really in video. I had to kind of teach myself about that. But I knew a lot about sort of the YouTubers of that time that were popular, and I knew a lot about what kind of content was resonating. So the Game Show Network hired me to create a division of their company that created game shows for Gen Z, basically, that would live on YouTube as the main platform. So
that's pretty early in 2013 to do that, because at that point in time, a lot of these mainstream media companies were worried about YouTube cannibalizing.
I think they tried to. Well, I think maybe later they got worried about it because it only lasted for 3 years. But in the beginning, they were very excited about it, and they brought me on. They said, "Look, we know that our demographic is pretty old, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people who watch game shows, as you can imagine, are pretty old.
Yeah.
And we want to bring in a younger generation. And we don't know if we can bring them in through the network, but we want to kind of look to other channels." So at the time, YouTube has always been what it is. But at that time, there was no TikTok yet. So it was really the only game in town. So we created something called Door 3, which was a channel in the Game Show Network universe that that basically created game shows that would appeal to the kids, right? So the hosts, instead of being, stand-up comedians like Steve Harvey, were like Glozell, who was like a popular YouTube star at the time. And all these kind of popular YouTube personalities were the hosts. And then we'd have these game shows. Some were shot, some had pretty big budgets and were shot, in like studios, and others like were shot like at our office, and so we had all sorts of, some were very popular. The channel ended up having about 300,000 subscribers by the end of my run there. Unfortunately, I think Game Show Network wasn't, this happens a lot where companies are excited about getting into digital, but they don't really have the infrastructure to support it financially. Like they don't have a team, an ad sales team that's, out there, selling, digital content to advertisers. They're not set up for that. And so there was never really a financial plan. It was really just an editorial plan for it. And it got to the point where I think they had to cut some corners, and they ended up getting rid of Door 3.
It was a cost for them, and they didn't generate enough revenue for them.
They didn't generate enough. I never understood exactly how they were going to generate revenue from it, but they could have. It could have been I think could have been a great success. But they had a whole change of regime. When I worked at Game Show Network, it was called GSN. I've noticed they've gone back to the Game Show Network. They seem to have embraced they were trying to become new and modern. And it seems like the decision has been made recently to kind of embrace
the
roots.
retro.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I don't watch it very often, but I imagine, a lot of the content is old game shows from like the 70s.
I mean,
or 80s.
the most popular show was always Family Feud. No matter how many new shows they brought on, Steve Harvey's Family Feud, I don't know if they had Richard Dawson's at the time. At the time, Sony
Anderson, what's his name? Who died a few years ago. Louis Anderson was a co-host, I think.
He was
a
host too.
Yeah.
Sony owned it, so they owned a lot of intellectual property that I really wanted to get my hands on. Like they owned the Gong Show, which I wanted to resuscitate as a digital version of the Gong Show, but unfortunately that was IP that I was unable to access. But yeah, it was interesting. It was really interesting to be in the television side of things. I had never worked for a TV company before, and I liked all the perks of it. Going up to a cafe, that had free frozen yogurt. It was kind of fun for me.
Yeah. And I'm curious, how did that come about as an opportunity for you, having been more of a writer for many years?
So I had, if you backtrack a little bit, I had worked at this company called break.com, which a lot of people don't remember, but before YouTube, there was a few websites that were really targeted at men, and break.com being one of them. And break.com became defy.com eventually, but break.com would show basically the kind of things that people remember YouTube for in the early days, the kind of like people falling off of their skateboards and, all that kind of stuff. Very popular. They created I was one of their first employees, and they ended up creating a network of websites, all geared towards men, lifestyle sites, and mixed martial arts site, et cetera. I ran those. And then they said, we got to get into video, John. And I said, okay. And so I hired a whole team of video people. We built a studio. This was, a very specific time in history where it was like before YouTube cannibalized and destroyed all these companies. And
before a lot of crowdsourcing, they kind of thought that they needed to create all the content themselves.
Exactly. We were, again, our big, the UGC was the big money earner, but UGC was unmonetizable because a lot of advertisers didn't really want to be around that content. So the decision was made to create our own content that was a little bit more palpable to advertisers, but that our audience would also like. So that's kind of how I got into video. It was sort of by default. I was the creative. I was the head of editorial, and suddenly they made me the head of editorial and digital. And, my secret was always surround myself with people who really know this space better than I do, and, make decisions, but let them make, I'm not going to pretend that I know how to direct a video. I would hire somebody to do that for me. I had a production coordinator that was, had years at HBO who knew how to pull together shoots. And, I would learn on the fly from these people, but I was really kind of more directing than actually doing the sort of the heavy lifting of actually shooting a video.
I want to get to Right About Now, which is your podcast and now your book.
Yes.
But before we get to that, I know you've had a long business relationship with Entrepreneur, and even was editor-in-chief of Green Entrepreneur, a magazine, for a number of years. So talk a little bit about that.
So Entrepreneur, I had thought my days after I left the Game Show Network, I had thought my days of being an editor were kind of behind me. I thought, oh, well, that industry doesn't really exist anymore. But, it still exists. And Entrepreneur is one of the few companies, Entrepreneur Media, that actually has a print magazine business and an online
And I
business.
had their editor on. He's
Jason Pfeiffer or Dan
yeah,
Bova?
yeah. He's an interesting cat because he's put a lot of effort into building up his own brand
He
and
has.
on LinkedIn and things like that, while he's also editing Entrepreneur.
Yeah, I've used him as an inspiration because he's very good at his own personal brand. And I've asked him, he does a lot of speaking. His name is Jason Pfeiffer. He's done a lot of speaking engagements where I know he gets quite a bit of money. And so I've always been very curious about how he did that. But yeah, so at Entrepreneur, they brought me on because they saw an opportunity in the cannabis industry. Now, this was 2000 and I don't know, 17, 18. And the cannabis industry was just starting to become a burgeoning industry. They the CEO of the company was involved personally in the cannabis industry. He invested in a few companies, and they were very excited about where that was going and wanted to be sort of on the front lines as a mainstream publication in covering cannabis. Not the lifestyle so much of cannabis, but the business
The
side
business
of it.
side, yeah.
And honestly, I'm not a cannabis consumer particularly. I probably should admit this, although I have admitted it publicly. I'm not a big cannabis consumer. But I was very interested in the business side of it because it was really like capitalism gone crazy. It was like, what do you do when you have this industry where everybody's basically selling the same thing, and watching companies how they would differentiate themselves and make decisions and market themselves was really fascinating to me. And I really actually liked meeting a lot of the people in the industry. So they hired me to do an initiative called Green Entrepreneur, which was a cannabis website and magazine and podcast that was all about the cannabis industry. And I did that for 3 years. I got very involved in that industry, met a million people, and built that product. Now, the sad thing about that experiment is that the cannabis industry started to kind of do a nosedive, starting with kind of the beginning of COVID, and has continued to nosedive. Entrepreneur again became concerned about the losses. There was also some complaints from advertisers about being around the entrepreneur content, being the cannabis content being on the main website, and some of the it is still, believe it or not, federally illegal, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
so banks, and there were certain banks that were not comfortable being around it, and so a decision was made to cut that publication. I stayed on at Entrepreneur for 2 more years, just doing, writing for them regularly. I hosted a website for a podcast for them called Dirty Money, which was all about financial crimes. It was a true crime podcast. I was very involved and still am very involved with Entrepreneur, but I don't work for them full time anymore. But it was an interesting experience to kind of, again, like pivot to I went from game shows to cannabis. Like, what the hell? Like my career has been very unusual.
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm sure you have older relatives or relatives in states where cannabis is not legal yet, or even like us, like me. I mean, I still carry around some baggage, even though it's legal on a state level here in California. What was it like for you? Either like when you joined that, you said, "Oh, hey family, I'm gonna be editor in chief of Green Entrepreneur magazine." They're like, "What are you smoking?" Probably, and then also, what was it like when the setback when they said we're going to cut this?
Yeah, I mean, so the first question, luckily my dad's no longer with us, but both my parents were hippies. So they smoked cannabis. They were not strangers to it. So they thought it was funny. In fact, my mother's boyfriend wanted me to, bring him cannabis all the time, to New York, where it was only legal. And I'm like, dude, you're gonna get me arrested.
You want me to bring that? First of all, I'm writing in a magazine. It's not like we have pot around every. Like, you want to get it on a plane and take it?
Although I was writing a magazine, but you can only imagine the amount of cannabis that was delivered to my door.
I can imagine. There must have been samples.
I could have opened a dispensary. I had so much cannabis at my house, and we would have parties, and I would just give it away to people because people would just send me free stuff all the time. But so I guess maybe it's because I live in Los Angeles. There was kind of a cool clout to being in the cannabis industry. There were some times when we were applying for like loans or like preschools, and I had to tell people that I worked at Green Entrepreneur. It made me a little bit uncomfortable, like that I would be associated with an illicit industry that is illegal in many states. But but I never really had a hang up. I think what upsets me now is, Green Entrepreneur has completely been it has no blueprint because there is you can't find it anymore. And it's a little sad because, I still have the magazines in my collection here, but Entrepreneur made a decision to just take it completely off the internet. So you can't find any of the stories. I worked on thousands of stories.
Yeah.
They're not there. So in some ways it's almost like 3 years of work is kind of in the ether. There is no.
Yeah.
So I can't point to it. If somebody asked, hey, John, tell me what you've been working on, I can't say, oh, look at this incredible feature we did at Green Entrepreneur, because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So that part has been a little bit of a bummer, but I understand the decision that they had to make. But it's just, it was a lot of my life given to something that doesn't
So you've
exist.
done a true crime podcast. You've done a podcast that was about cannabis, and then you find your way back to your original love, which is writing, with the Right About Now podcast.
Yeah, well, Right About Now was actually first. I had started Right About Now. It was a class. I had taken a class in digital marketing. I'm one of these people that always kind of tries to kind of understand new things that are happening and kind of be up on what's going on. So I felt like I didn't know enough about how to market myself in the digital world. So I took a course, and one of the assignments was to create a something that would promote the business you were trying to promote in the digital world. And the idea that I came up with is to create a podcast to promote my at the time ghostwriting business. And the podcast was called Right About Now, and I put out a few episodes, and I loved it so much. I just loved everything about it. It kind of combined my journalism background with my love of interviewing people, with my sort of, music production, DJing background. Everything was like what I loved. And so I continued doing Right About Now as a podcast, independent of this class. That class was long gone. And people started, noticing what I was doing. And at one point, somebody who I knew at SAG-AFTRA, the union, the Screen Actors Guild, said, hey, I noticed you have a podcast. We're trying to do a podcast. Do you know anybody that could help us, create, launch this podcast? And I said, I can do it. I can help you do it. I had never thought about being a podcast producer, but I knew everything about podcasting, and I didn't understand why I couldn't help them do it. And so that was the beginning of my first assignment as a producer of podcasts, rather than just being a host and doing my own podcast. So SAG-AFTRA was my first client, which is a great client to have. They're a wonderful organization. And I've been working for them for the last 5 years, and I help them basically produce their podcast every 2 weeks. They've
including during the SAG strike. What was that like?
That was hard. That was really interesting, because that was a time when the podcast was really useful as a way to communicate with the membership. The most challenging thing about that was that the two people who
hosted it couldn't do it, right?
Yeah, were the people that were the busiest, right? So it's like the host is a guy by the name of Duncan Crabtree Ireland, who's the national executive director who's pretty much the number two in charge after Fran Drescher, who's the president. And so he was never available for good reasons. He's always negotiating. So it was always like, all right, Duncan, we're going to record this at 1 a.m. at some hotel in, Prague, wherever you're not Prague, because wherever you're traveling. He was always traveling around. And, and he was really always game. He loves doing podcasts. So that was good, but it was always, that was the challenge. It was always trying to get him and get the guests to be available, because they were so busy, in strike mode. But I think the podcast probably helped in terms of, just communicating what they wanted to communicate to the membership.
I mean, that's one of the challenges, right? In that kind of situation is they're trying to communicate to their membership and keep them aligned during, what was it, 9-10 months or something like that? It
felt like forever. Yeah, it was almost a year.
It was a long strike.
It was a really long strike, and I could tell it was going to be long from the very beginning, because they would be like, oh, we're not even going to meet with them for another two months. Like the AMPTC, I think it is, which is the organization they were negotiating with, was just really playing hardball and holding out. And so there was a lot of downtime, and then there was a lot of not downtime, like very intense negotiations. And then, trying to get our message out there. I say the SAG-AFTRA message out there to the, to the world, to the membership, and trying to mobilize people. We did a lot of episodes that were like about the strike captains. And I actually would go sometimes with my microphone to the picket lines. I live right near Paramount. So I would walk over to Paramount and stand at the gates with my microphone and interview a bunch of people on the lines. I met a lot of really interesting people, as you can imagine.
Well, there are a lot of
you have a bunch of
celebrities
actors,
were down there too.
Yeah, no, for sure. And when you have a lot of actors, striking, there's a lot of creative ideas, and like they had little like groups, like they had, the Latina actresses for SAG-AFTRA, and they would have like they would do like little dances and with music, and there was the stand-up comics for SAG-AFTRA, and they would do a whole routine, like just on the picket line. I remember going to the Disney picket, and they were screaming at Iger, and I mean, it was interesting to see how it was done.
Yeah, and what people forget about that is that a lot of those actors are working actors who they're not Tom Hanks. They're not like big celebrities that have lots of money in the bank. And it really, was a struggle for many of them.
Yeah, and they still, unfortunately, it hasn't really come back to where it was. And we just did an episode about how that's not really the strike. It was more, at least from SAG-AFTRA's perspective, that really wasn't the strike that did that. That was where the business was going anyway. But a lot of these people, Hollywood has not returned to what it was pre-strike, and maybe never will. And so a lot of these people, like you're saying, people who were not in the top, 1%, 0.5% of actors, who are pretty much the entire SAG-AFTRA membership, is having to do what I've had to do a lot of my career, which is pivot and try to figure out how can my skill set be applied in other ways other than the things that I usually do.
Sit in an interesting spot, having been in journalism, having seen the change in the magazine industry and content marketing, and even the Screen Actors Guild, and even Hollywood, how, maybe I think that the growth in content marketing and the growth in user-generated content on platforms like YouTube have taken eyeballs and attention away from the traditional media platforms, taking people away from going and seeing movies in the movie theater, or watching TV on NBC or ABC or CBS, or those sorts of things.
UGC is definitely something that has cut into the traditional media landscape. I mean, I think of our kids. Like, my kids don't really watch television. They watch YouTube. They watch TikTok. I mean, my daughter scrolls. She knows about television. She knows it, and she watches. She'll go to Netflix and maybe watch a series that she hears about, or she likes to watch like old stuff, like I don't even remember, but she watches kind of like classic stuff. But it's interesting, like they don't consume media the way we do. Older people do, and so that's affected the industry quite a bit. And
it scares me a bit, because I got young kids, and I really want to limit. I've limited their consumption of YouTube, because I just see them watching this stuff, and I sound like an old dude when I say this, but I mean, I see them watching stuff that just seems insane, and I worry about them having like the attention span of a gnat.
I worry about that too, and then I just think, okay, didn't our parents say that about us with television? And like, you just hope that this isn't completely damaging their brains. But if you have kids of a certain age, it's really hard to not think that it's not having the most positive effect. I mean, we could have a whole separate podcast about the effect of social media on kids, but it's that kind of, and I don't know if you've ever fallen down the rabbit hole of just scrolling through like Instagram. I mean, I can
it's hard
get
not
lost.
to these days. You just like somehow wait, how did I get here? I'm flicking through these stupid videos,
and they just have the algorithm, and it's so seductive, and they're showing me all these videos that I want to watch of like, old baseball games from 1984. Like, it's like stuff, they just know stuff that I'd be interested in. And it's crazy. I can see, they do they serve the same stuff to my kids? Yeah. So it's, we try to limit it. I feel like the more we limit it, the more they want it. So I almost want them to get sick of it on their own. I do think that my daughter, when she can get, she's like, I can't look at my phone anymore. Dad, can we take a walk? Can we do something else? Yeah.
Another one we haven't really touched on, because I want to transition to talking about the book version of Right About Now.
Sure.
But before we get to that, you've also edited some big bestsellers. And so there's another industry, publishing, book publishing. Is there a place today for the role of a big, meaty, definitive book, Emotional Intelligence, The Science of Success, that, gets a ton of media attention and really kind of changes the narrative around a topic, or it makes us think in a different way?
I like to believe that books will always have a place. I know that they're probably not as important as they were maybe 25 years ago, but there's still kind of cachet and a credibility that comes with a book rather than, reading an article or reading something online. Just the weight, literally the weight of a book. I just think the publishing industry has changed so much that you don't, I'm still kind of a snob. Like I still believed or was a snob until about a year ago that, you had to have a major publisher publish your book in order for it to be anything that in order to be legitimate. Right. And it's one of the reasons I had never published my own book because I never had I thought a good enough idea to even present to a publisher. And so I just didn't go that route. I wrote a lot of books for other people, like you said, and I edited a lot of books for other people. But in talking to Anna David, our mutual friend who has her own indie publishing company, she kind of convinced me, look, it's good to have a book out there for your own brand, for your own publicity, for your own just for your own ego, and maybe it doesn't have to have like Random House or Penguin behind it. Like maybe I can just be a small publisher like hers, but I can use my various channels to publicize it. And she convinced me and I did it. And I'm really happy I did it. And I'm not embarrassed to tell my snotty media friends, they'll always say, oh yeah, who published it? I'm like, well, I don't say it's self-published because I feel like that for some reason I can't go there. But I say it's an indie publisher, and that's true. It's not self-published. I didn't publish it myself. So I think there's less of a stigma around that, and also it just makes more sense economically now for writers to do that because it kind of takes out the middleman. You can do it much quicker. My book, I wrote it and it took me like about 6 months to write it. And then, when Anna got her hands on it, it was like a 2 or 3 month process and all of a sudden it was available. That would be unheard of in traditional publishing. It would be years until my book would be, released. So, I think there's a lot of advantages. I feel like that's a big difference that we're seeing now. And I think there is still an advantage to having a book. It just might be distributed in a different way than the old days.
Right. And let's talk about the book that you came out with. So right about now, it was a podcast, it became a book. You've interviewed some amazing authors, Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, AJ Jacobs, who I've had on this podcast.
Oh, you have? Oh, he's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's super entertaining guy, fun to talk to. Talk a little bit about that, about those different conversations that went into the book.
I had always wanted to make basically I had interviewed like over 200 really, like you mentioned, some really interesting authors. Max Brooks, who wrote the Zombie Survival Guide, the son of Mel Brooks, David Gran, who wrote The Killers of the Flower Moon. So there was a lot of people I had interviewed over the years that I thought were really interesting, but I never could figure out exactly what to make the book about. And so the first thing that inspired me is Terry Gross, who is the host of Fresh Air, put out a book a few years ago that was kind of like a best of her podcast, and it was kind
Tim
of like
Ferriss has done this too.
And it was
different volumes,
right? And it was kind of like excerpts, but it was really kind of a oral history type of thing. It was just transcripts, but like portions of interviews, and she, and I thought, okay, so I won't just doing that. The fact that she had done that and Tim Ferriss had done things like that seemed to me like that could be a way. But then I was like, well, what am I gonna? I felt like I needed a focus. Because I talk about just like your show, we talk about so many different topics. I didn't really want to do a how-to writing book. And one of the things I always found the most interesting in my interviews is it's kind of like the way you open up your story, your podcast was I always kind of get their origin story, like how these people got started as writers. Because I always find that kind of inspirational and I just love a good origin story. I mean, I love a good origin story in the movies. I love The Godfather 2. I love, Star Wars, whatever it is. Like I love origin stories, right? And I think there's a reason they're so popular in Hollywood. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to focus on the origin stories. That'll be the focus because I pretty much always universally asked my guests what, how they got started. And a lot of them had some really interesting stories. So I collected the ones that I thought were the most interesting, the most diverse. And I put them all into a book. I obviously told my own origin story. I explained a little bit about why I think origin stories are important, not only for writers, but just in general for entrepreneurs. I've written actually an article for Entrepreneur recently about, why businesses should have their own origin story. Like what the significance of like publicizing an origin story is. I mean, you think of, Apple or Nike, they have great origin stories. Starbucks,
they do. Yeah.
And so there's something about that. There's something
it's great
about
content marketing. It's great grist for content marketing.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we forget, I think sometimes companies and individuals forget that might be a good way to market yourself. So I focused on that. That was my focus. And I had a lot of like interesting stories to tell. I mean, some that come to mind, you know, I mean, Kristen Hanna, who is like one of the best-selling authors of all time, she wrote, she has The Women, which has been like a bestseller now, like it's on the bestseller list. I think it's been a bestseller for like the last, I don't know, 20 weeks. She had just written that book and came on my podcast to talk about her story. And she has one of those stories where she wanted to be a lawyer and she was studying to be a lawyer and her mother got sick. And as a way to kind of bond with her mother, they wrote a book together because they'd always wanted to write a historical fiction book together. And that was kind of their bonding thing. And then her mom passed away and she put the book in a box. And when she was pregnant, she took the box out of the shelf and started looking through it and said, this is actually a pretty good story. I'm going to finish this. And I'm going to finish this book and I'm going to submit it to a publisher. And the publisher or the agent looked at it and she said, well, you don't really know how to write a book yet, but there's something here. So think, what my advice to you would be like, go back and revise this. So she went and read every bestseller that was out at the time. She read like all the bestsellers and started figuring out like, what is the formula here? Like, what is it that I'm missing? And figured, smart enough to figure out, okay, there is a formula and I think I can get it. And she redid the story sort of using that formula and sold her first book. And that, to me, and never became a lawyer again. So like, people like, you think of somebody like a Kristen Hanna, like, oh, she probably, went to, had been writing her whole life and went to, college to be a writer. No, like she kind of fell into it. And that was actually what I found with a lot of the origin stories of the writers I interviewed, is that they never intended to be writers. They liked reading. There was a common thread where they did like to read, but they didn't think they were going to be writers. Or the kind of writers that they would become. They just kind of fell into it. They were open enough to kind of new opportunities that these things fell on them. I mean, another story, like, so Max Brooks, who I mentioned, who's the son of Mel Brooks, a lot of expectations of this guy growing up, son of Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Anne Bancroft and Mel Brooks are your parents, right? So a lot of expectations that he would be this comedy writer. He even got a job at SNL, but was miserable, never felt like he was his dad. I mean, he's a really funny guy. I know Max is a friend of mine, but he never felt comfortable in that kind of writer's room environment. And really what he loved was zombies and like comics and so sort of on the side, he started writing this zombie survival guide, which wasn't a joke. It was a real, like, he imagined what would a survival guide look like if there was actually a zombie apocalypse. And he sent it to his agent, and his agent said, this is not funny enough. You need to make this funny. He said, no, I don't want this to be funny. This is not supposed to be funny. And the guy's like, I don't know if I can sell this thing. And he did sell it, probably, with Brooks' name helped, but it didn't do that well because it was being marketed as a comedy book. And people were like, this isn't funny. And then he was able to get Zack Snyder, who I guess is like a front man from a huge heavy metal band, who's a real comic nerd and a zombie guy, to put him on his podcast.
Sister? Is he from?
Yeah, from Twisted Sister,
yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Zack Snyder put him on his podcast and said, and Max started talking about zombies in a way that was real. Like, it was like he took zombies seriously as if they were a real thing, because that's the way he thinks about zombie apocalypses, right? Like, that's not that it's like really going to happen, but he considers it from a military and kind of like survivalist standpoint. And that really caught on with Zack Snyder's audience, and he suddenly found a whole new audience. So anyway, those are kind of some of the origin stories I love to tell. And I just found like there was a lot. AJ got a great one. You said AJ Jacobs was on your show. He has a great one. I mean, they all had different kind of ways, but none of them were expected. I don't think you can plan your career. Like, I think you and I have seen that, right? Like, we thought maybe like when we were 22, we were going to be one thing, and we ended up. You
can see it, how it's going to go, and it never does. Yeah,
it never does. And you just have to be open to the unknown and sometimes take some leaps.
And the Martian, Andy Weir, that's a crazy one too, because I think he published that as a serial, maybe on a blog or something.
It was a blog. He was giving it away for free.
Yeah.
I mean, he was basically he was like a computer, nerd, like an IT guy.
Right.
And but he loved, kind of like Max, he had a side kind of passion, and that was, space exploration and science. And he was writing this, imagining what it would be like if somebody had to survive on Mars, and, very well researched. stuff. And his audience, his free blog audience was like, this is great, but can you like, I don't want to read it on a blog. I want to like put it in a book format
Like
for
on
me
a
or
Kindle.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he did that, but he didn't charge. And so people were reading for free. And then eventually I think he was like, if I charge them 99 cents, I might even make some money. And, the rest is history. Like it became one of the best selling books. And then, it became such a popular indie book on Amazon that book publishers took notice. And then, they gave him an advance. And then they actually distributed the book, under a big major publishing. So he got a big publishing deal. But his whole thing was really just write about what you love and the audience will come. Like he wasn't trying to write a science fiction book. He was just trying to write about what he thinks would happen if a guy got stranded on Mars and had to survive on his own.
Right. Right.
With
there's
really
so many
good research science. Yeah.
There are many great books that have been written about writing or the process of writing. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott comes to mind. On Writing by Stephen King. I'm actually reading one right now by William Goldman, the longtime screenwriter, Adventures in the Screen Trade.
Great book. Nobody knows anything, right? What is it? His thing about nobody knows anything. That
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Where do you see your book fitting in?
Great question. I see it. I mean, God, if I can be mentioned in the same phrase as Bird by Bird or On Writing by Stephen King, I would be thrilled. But I do see it as being a book that you would maybe give to somebody who is looking for inspiration as a writer. It's not a how-to book. It's more of a book of great stories that will get you motivated and make you realize, hey, I can do this too. I think it's very relatable. There's probably some story in there that will probably feel like, oh, that's me. That was me. That's me right now. Or that was me 5 years ago. And not only for people who are aspiring writers, but for people who are writing now, who are kind of hitting roadblocks. It's nice to read about your peers who have been successful and that they've struggled too. And that they never, had any designs to, they never thought they were going to be successful, and look what happened to them. So I sort of see it in that kind of inspirational category, motivational kind of category.
Yeah. I want to, we've gone way over, so I apologize for that. I want to wrap up.
I'm enjoying talking to you.
Yeah, no, this has been really interesting, and love the different paths in your career and everything. I love to wrap up with a question that I call my gratitude question. So I'm a big fan of expressing gratitude, especially to peers and contemporaries, maybe mentors, people who've been with you in your career journey, maybe different steps in the way, and especially if they're still with you. Sometimes people default to mentioning their family or their friends or something like that. But I love to give you opportunity for any peers, contemporaries, others out there who are doing similar things as you in your industry, although you've been in multiple different industries. Anyone in particular you'd want to shout out and thank?
I mean, I always feel like I really should have, it's a kind of great sadness in my life. In fact, I never really found a mentor that I could really, and maybe because I wasn't looking for one, but who really could help me along various phases of my career. There have been different people at different stages of my career. So early in my life, it was my dad, because my dad was a Hollywood screen composer, did movie music, right? So we lived in New York, but my dad was always out here in LA, doing these movie scores. And like you said, roaming around the Hollywood lots, and they would, when he was on a movie, he would get a special designated parking space that he could have on the lot. And that was, but as soon as the movie was over, like his parking space would go away, which is such a Hollywood thing, right? You're only kind of famous for a fleeting moment. But he was always an inspiration because I grew up with a dad who made a living being creative. And so, I just remember, waking up at 3 a.m, hearing my dad banging on the piano, and, being very frustrated but always just, I thought growing up, that's what you did. Like you created things for a living and people paid you to do that. I didn't realize that my dad was such an oddball, that there weren't a lot of people doing that, that most of the people, And so that was my first early inspiration. And then later it just became various people I was working with. I had a mentor at my first job at Child Magazine, 2 mentors there, women who were, at least 10, maybe 5 or 10 years ahead of me in their careers. And they really believed in me. And I remember one time, they would always tell me how great things were. And then one time I handed in some copy and I got back no notes, and then a few negative things and no notes. And my mentor said to me, that's when you know you've arrived, when I don't have to keep telling you how great you are anymore. You know you're great. So now I'm just going to start telling you, what you need to change and what you need to fix and stuff. And I thought that was so interesting. And I've done that to some of my employees, to say, once you get to a certain level, the expectation is that you're going to be good. So don't keep looking for that praise because, you know you're good enough. You're a big deal. So those people taught me that. And I've just, over the years, I've had to find different role models in different areas that I've been in. But unfortunately, there's no like real one person. It's sad because a lot of people I interview or talk to me about how, I had this mentor, or I'm part of a mentor group. I will say, and this is kind of a weird thing, but it's just coming to me now. So I have a therapist. I guess I'm a Jew in LA. I have a therapist, right? And she told me, she had convinced me she said, I have this men's group that we meet once a week. I pick, 6 guys that are my clients, and I sit in the room, but basically I don't do that much. You guys just talk and about whatever's on your mind. That has been really transformative for me because I don't think men have enough opportunities to really talk to each other honestly about stuff that's going on in their lives. I have a lot of friends, but we don't have those kinds of conversations. And so that has been, I don't know if that's a mentorship as much, but that has been something that has been incredibly, if I had to give a blessing, that would be something that has really changed my life in the last few years. Just having these group of guys, total strangers, that I'm just able to talk to about, things that I'm facing in my career, things that I'm facing in my love life, or whatever it is, like honest interaction with fellow guys. I think that would help the world if there were more groups like that.
And I think it would be even better if it was all former Jakes from Cosmo.
I've started
that'd be a
thinking
group
about
you should
doing
put together.
doing a Facebook group of just former Jakes. I met one former Jake. We should start them like we probably have a lot of great things to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. This was a lot of fun, Jonathan. Where can people go to learn more about you, connect with you, learn more about the book and the podcast?
The best place to go is writeaboutnowmedia.com. That is the home of all things John. It has my book where you can order it. I teach classes. I've started to teach some writing classes, so you can find out about those. I've got one that I'm teaching later this month that I'm kind of freaking out about, but it's going to be great. It's the first time I've ever taught it. It's about how to use AI as a writing partner. I've decided to embrace AI rather than run away from it and cower in the corner, since I think it's here to stay. But writeaboutnowmedia.com, you'll find out all about that stuff.
Excellent. Jonathan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.